Hello, my name is Erin Peer, and this presentation is for EDTP645, taught by Dr. and Professor John Sullivan through the University of Maryland University College. My initial action research project, developed over the last 2 semesters, questions the impact music can have on understanding Shakespearean sonnets. However, I quickly realized that the needs of the student I tutored this semester outweighed my initial plan. This is a new plan designed around the student I've worked with over the past 10 weeks. I currently work at Corpus Christi School located in Falls Church, Virginia. My data and findings are from working with an 8th grade student at the school twice a week for approximately 45 minutes each session. I've had the opportunity to observe this student and her study and work habits over the last 12 months, and I was and am determined to find a way to assist her in her academic endeavors. Falls Church, Virginia has a high number of Hispanic residents, and approximately 50% of the student body at Corpus Christi are of Hispanic origin. Almost all of these students speak Spanish at home to one or both parents and English at school. Abby, the girl I tutored, is one of these students. She has spoken English for many, many years, and she has a solid foundation of the English grammatical rules, but she struggles slightly with reading, and her vocabulary grades were low. Since my content area is secondary English education, I saw an opportunity to be of assistance. From what I've observed, Abby's current English teacher's instruction style has been a block to her comprehension. The teacher presents their weekly vocabulary words and essentially leaves the students to their own devices. The students are left to learn the words on their own without examining their prefixes or roots or use them in context before completing their work. The teacher has the students create paragraphs every week using the vocabulary words. However, a lot of the students struggle with using the words correctly in context. Instead of the teacher recognizing half of the class needs help with this and adjusting her teaching style, she publicly berates them and accuses them of not studying enough. The purpose of this study is to examine the impact vocabulary tools, particularly those centered around the Frere model, has on student comprehension and retention. I wanted to know, would providing remedial help for Abby and using appropriate teaching tools strengthen her understanding and ultimately her grade? This project will help clarify what teaching tools are effective. Abby appeared to be what Burden and Bird referred to as a struggling learner. This is a student who does not learn at an average rate. The student may have a limited attention span and deficiencies in basic skills such as reading, writing, and mathematics. He or she needs frequent feedback, corrective instruction, special instructional pacing, instructional variety, and perhaps modified materials. The authors provide a list of suggestions when working with students who struggle, which include varying instructional technique, developing lessons around the student's needs, providing an encouraging, supportive environment, assisting students who need remediation, and providing study aids. Abby has not been receiving any of these in her current curriculum. Most of her teachers do not offer to stay after school for additional help. Many of them are anxious to leave as soon as the students do. Abby is part of a class where almost 50% of the students struggle with vocabulary and grammar composition. In the text Content Area Reading and Literacy, the authors assert that staying focused on what adolescents who struggle with reading bring to their coursework is an important instructional principle, one that is backed by years of research and practice. They go on to say that even with the best literacy instruction in the early grades, some adolescents will enter secondary school with reading difficulties that may be associated with underdeveloped technical vocabularies, boredom with a curriculum that seemingly has little relevance to their everyday lives, and so on. It is clear to me, and many of the teachers on staff, that some of the students are struggling, but nobody is taking action to correct the deficiencies. Most of Abby's teachers are older, not as engaged in technology, and very much set in their ways, foremost generally believing if a student's grades are low, it is because the student is not putting forth the right amount of effort in studying. I spoke with Abby and asked her if she would like to work with me, which she agreed to. I then spoke with some of her teachers. Her English teacher is convinced Abby's deficiencies have to do with speaking another language at home. Her mother speaks perfect English without any hint of an accent, as does Abby. However, Abby does speak Spanish to her father. The science teacher believes Abby has a slight learning disability and no short-term memory retention. Both of these teachers have had Abby as a student for more than 2 years. In the text, Assessment of Student Achievement, it indicates there are two types of assessment, formative and diagnostic. When I began working with Abby, I decided to use a variety of formative assessments to monitor learning progress and to provide corrective prescriptions to improve learning. We conducted all of our tutoring sessions in an empty classroom at the school, which had a chalkboard, plain, bare walls, and long tables grouped in a U shape. To understand exactly what I was grappling with, I used a Facebook activity in our first two sessions. Like most young people, Abby uses and enjoys Facebook. I had Abby create statuses using the vocabulary words, thinking perhaps some differentiated instruction might overcome any boredom she might have with the topics that don't seem to apply to her life. In the book Strategies That Work, the author discusses the importance of teachers creating learning experience that help their students make connections to build understanding. However, it became clear very quickly that if Abby didn't understand the word, she definitely wasn't able to use it correctly in context. I then turned to vocabulary squares, similar to the Frere model, to help her further her understanding of each word. There are 4 quadrants, with the titles of prefix, definition, example, and picture written in them. This strategy was developed by Gary Hopkins, who taught middle and high school students in Montana. In the text Content Area Reading and Literacy, the authors explain, it is often easier to remember a new word and its meaning if one can connect it with a strong visual image. Verbal-visual associations are often recommended as particularly useful word learning strategies. The following weeks were filled with many vocabulary square sheets. Abby seemed to enjoy taking apart the word, making connections to prefixes or root words she knew, as well as drawing a picture of association. We used a lot of morphemic analysis and context clues analysis as well. In the beginning, we oftentimes focused on one topic for the tutoring session, such as prefixes. The next session we would focus on mental imaging and the pictures the words created in her mind. After a couple of weeks, we were using all 4 squares of the vocabulary sheets. Abby's mood was a bit reserved the first 4 weeks of tutoring. She didn't always look me in the eye and seemed embarrassed. As her grades steadily increased, she seemed to grow more confident. She was more excited to meet together, and she made steady eye contact with me. I introduced candy incentives halfway through my research, and that drove her to try even harder. Her class tests follow the same format week in and week out, as pictured here. The students are expected to know the pronunciation, part of speech, definitions, synonyms, antonyms, and sentence context for each word. When we started the tutoring session, Abby's overall grade hovered between a 68 to a 72%. Since our sessions began, her next 2 grades increased to a 76% and 82%. After the 82% score, the class had to take a 3-unit test of 70 questions that covered 60 words and all their parts. Abby scored a 70%. The test was very visually condensed with a small font, and it struck me that she might have some visual processing skills, which could be the reason she mispronounces words and leaves off some endings to words when she reads. Not dyslexia per se, but perhaps a mild derivative of it. I created what I call the focuser. I cut a piece of white tag board into an 8.5 by 11 sheet, and then I cut a thin rectangular piece from the center, which only allowed her to see one question at a time. She had scored a 64% on a verb test, one that we had not studied for, and to help prove my theory, I obtained a blank copy of the test before the teacher handed all the tests back to the class and had her retake it with the focuser. She went from a 64% to an 84%. From then on, I had her use the focuser each week on her test. Her grades were, in order, from that point on, 86%, 92%, 100%, and 84%. Abby certainly worked very hard over these weeks of research. I think my style of teaching was something she wasn't used to and something she responded positively to. In the book, Teaching Students with Mild and High Incidence Disabilities at the Secondary Level, the authors discuss the importance of teachers giving feedback related to their performance and reteaching with additional modeling. Additional is the key word here. Abby was receiving little to no modeling, so she didn't really know how to understand the vocabulary words or their context. She wasn't getting proper or mostly any feedback from her English teacher. When she did, It was usually negative, in the form of berating her in front of the class when she didn't use the word properly. Leslie Cochran discusses the concept that classroom culture is essential. The teacher should be creating an environment where they are not afraid to take risks, whether they are right or wrong, without the fear of being judged. Abby has not received this. Ms. Cochran also asserts that there must be time set aside for individual work and support. That, too, has not been provided. Now that the project has come to a close, I will be offering the following suggestions to Abby's family and teachers, more specifically her English teacher. Abby's parents should have her tested to rule out any processing issues. Although her vocabulary grades increased in this study, her writing skills are still weak, as well as her communicative skills. My focuser seemed to help quite a bit, but it isn't a professional fix, and if there is something to help her more appropriately, I would want her to discover that. I would recommend her English teacher implement the use of vocabulary square sheets. Since half of the class is struggling, it would be well worth the time, and I believe it would help in yielding higher test scores. Some of the teacher's students who struggle the most have fantastic memories. They simply don't have any personal associations to the material. I would also suggest that she offer to the students and parents tutoring times, where struggling students can work with her independently. Lastly, I would suggest, as difficult as it might be to hear, that she re-examine her lesson plans each week after test scores have been entered. This particular teacher is extremely rigid in following the curriculum, which is the goal for every instructor, but she is moving on to topics before the previous topics are even close to being mastered. I would like to recommend to the principal appropriate training materials and/or courses for the English teacher, or perhaps it would be best to make it a staff suggestion to avoid singling anyone out. This is the second year I've sat in this teacher's classroom on a daily basis, and it's very painful to hear her make comments to the children that insinuate they are lazy and/or unintelligent. Perhaps she doesn't realize she's doing it and that is how she was raised, but as an educator it is very disconcerting and it needs to stop. Abby's progress since my work with her has been tremendous. She is happier and more confident. I consider this study a success since both the student and the teacher have increased their understandings. Thank you for listening.